Hello. I know our course is getting to the point where I won't say it's practically over, but we're at least three quarters of the way through it. And so perhaps it's a bit superfluous of what I'm going to say, but I think it is important because you've got at least two small essays to do and then the major paper on suffering. And so I think what I'm going to say is relevant. And it's especially relevant in respect to other papers that you'll have to do in other courses. Um, I'm a bit disappointed in the way that a number of you have approached essays in this course. And I just want to make some references to some of the mistakes that you've been making. And it goes in conjunction with what I said, how to make a good, write a good paper at the beginning of the course. Just some simple things first of all, and then I'll try and say some deeper things and take it from there. When you write, a number of you frequently say, I feel this, and I make comments. I don't, with due respect to you, I'm not concerned about your feelings. I'm concerned about your thinking. Now, I know this goes along with what I'd call a postmodern perspective in today's world. In other words, everybody has an opinion, and the opinion can't be actually brought against, so that we've lost the perspective of what you might call objective truth, so that everybody can say, well, I have an opinion of this, or I feel this way. But you're not meant to impinge upon what other people feel, because that's a notion of intolerance of what others say. But the notion of the university is such that you are able to go in and offer what's called, I call it, public truth. In other words, what comes out of your mouth is based upon the integrity of you as a person. When it comes out of your mouth, or in this case, what's written down, then it's objectified on a piece of paper or on a screen of a monitor, and then it's up for grabs. In other words, whether who agrees with it and who disagrees with it. It's what I call Socratic dialogue. In that case, what you put out there, it's a question of whether I agree with it or whether I disagree with it. So I'm not concerned about how you feel. I'm concerned about how you think. And so I want to tell you and encourage you, don't state how you feel. State how you think. That's the key. I'm listening. I'm encouraging you all the time to put your arguments down and back them up in terms of not simply an assertion, but with reasons of why you think the way that you do. That is very, very important. Another element of it is to be consistent in the way that you use your pronouns. In a sentence, if you're referring to humanity or all of us, in the sense that you're keeping to the first person pronoun we, don't use we in one sentence and then suddenly revert to you. I'm not sure what you means. Does it mean you and me? Or does it mean you and everybody? In other words, keep it general. Keep it consistent with one person. It's we. I prefer it personally in the sense of keep it impersonal in terms of the third person singular or plural. Now, this is important. Avoid the element of being chatty. When you write, and I'm sure you must do this, those of you who are doing nursing, you can't afford to be chatty when you're involved in a science project. You have to write in a dispassionate way, in the sense that you're writing objectively, outside of yourself in a way, as you're writing scientific formulas or you're describing how a patient would respond in a way that's acceptable to your lecturers who are prescribing a particular medicine or a way to do therapeutic research that's beneficial to a patient. I don't know, I'm just talking off the top of my head as a layperson in respect to nursing and just making that up. Well, it's the same with theology. Just because most of you come out of a church tradition, you can't talk informally like you do in a Bible class. Not when you're studying theology. I would have thought that going through McGrath's book in particular, you can see the sophistication that comes from theological endeavour. A good example of that is when you were studying the Trinity in the work of Karl Barth, which was a difficult chapter as you look through, for example, Sarah Coatley's work and Karl Barth's sophistication of describing the inner or interrelationships among the Trinity. Now, I'm saying that you can't be chatty in the sense of making what I call informal relationships in terms of you and I, as you are addressing me, in a paper. You've got to be informal. Now, I don't mean to be demeaning to you in this, but I'm going to use a parallel. But I don't mean it in the sense of a parallel of circumstances, but there is an element that I'm going to bring out. The element is this, is that for a number of years I worked in conjunction with teaching at Simpson University. I worked at the Jesus Center in Chico, which we served 100,000 meals every year to homeless people, drug addicts. We had homes for drug addicts, help people find work. And I'm a middle class person, presumably like you are too. In other words, I was moving towards a goal all the time, just like you are. I knew what to do to achieve the goal. So one of the mistakes that I made early on when I was talking to frequently homeless people or drug addicts who were trying to get themselves out of the position of where they were, in other words, they'd fallen on hard times and they were trying to get work and get into an apartment and so forth, and they would say to me, I've got a job interview at Home Depot. All right, so I would say, well, let me help you with the interview. And I would go through and tell them how to do it. Of walk into the interview, be confident, dress well, look at the people who are interviewing you, say hello, give eye contact, anticipate what the questions are, have a question to ask them yourself and so forth, and be respectful and know what questions they would ask you, try and anticipate them, maybe even practice with your friends before you go into the interview. Many times the people that I was helping to interview, they didn't get the job. And when I worked out why they didn't get the job, what I realized is that many of them had not actually had any experience of moving forward in a middle class existence. Because when they went into the interview, what they did is they didn't use what I call informal language, the kind of language that you and I use when we go into an interview. We didn't use, when we go into an interview, chatty language. When you go into an interview, you don't use the kind of language you use when you're talking to your friends or when you're going to buy something in a store. In other words, they would go into the interview not really thinking about how they dressed, and they would walk in the door and say, how are you all doing? And then sit down and smile and then look around, and as the questions would come out, they would just answer in brief sentences and so forth, and not make much of an impression because their responses would be very chatty. In other words, they were talking informally, not realizing how to talk formally, because you're there to impress them to get the job. And one talk from me on how to talk formally was not sufficient, because they had had, many of them frequently, a lifetime from their parents and their friends, because of the environment they are in which it was reinforced that to live in that environment, they had to talk as they did, because many times of the structural elements of what it meant to be in a culture of poverty, or because of their own situation in life, sometimes because of their own victimhood that they played out of, sometimes because of circumstances out of control. Now, I want to use that as a parallelism, not that you or me are in a situation in which we're sort of like homeless people in a sense, but the parallel's there. The parallel between chatty language, informal language and formal language. when you're writing an essay, a paper, you write formally, not informally. You can't do it in nursing or anthropology or history in the same way you can't do it theologically. And so I'm wondering, especially those of you who write this way, who are far into your course in an undergraduate degree, who do this, I'm wondering how you can get away with it when you're dealing with science material or anthropological material and so forth. You can't do that. You can't do it in theology. So I'm wondering where it comes from. Does it come from the extensive material that you've absorbed in Bible class and think that you can use that within the context of theological studies? You can't. So I want to encourage you not to write in a chatty form. I don't mean to disrespect you in any way whatsoever. I want to harden you to the principles of academic life, because academic life is to prepare you for the future of your professional life. Because when you're in an organization of 5,000 people and you're writing a memo to 5,000 people out there, you can't write in a chatty form. You've got to write in a more formal structure so that people understand exactly what you're talking about, and they can't be ringing you up on the telephone or sending you a text message saying, well, what did you mean by so-and-so, etc. It's got to stand by itself as an objective form outside of your own mind. And that's true in terms of what you write to me as a paper. It's an objective form of your thinking, not your feeling, outside of yourself. So I want to encourage you to do that. And then other simple things. When you write and quote a source, you must cite that source. I find it hard to understand at this stage why you're not citing the source in a paper, those of you who do that. And then in respect to that too, if you use a Google source, by this stage surely you're aware of the what would I call it? The magnification of sources in Google. In other words, the sources that Google uses run the whole gamut, from scholarly sources to absolutely tepid sources that are everyday sources from people who have no scholarly endeavour whatsoever, or who operate on a very ordinary, mundane level for people who aren't concerned in terms of a scholarly bent. Now, you might say, well, I don't really have a scholarly bent. Well, you have to have something of an academic bent that's beyond the mundane. Hence, you are learning to think at a university, because that's what a university is all about, is to sharpen your thinking. And therefore, when you especially are sharpening your thinking and writing a paper, look at the sources you use on Google, especially theologically. Don't use populistic sources. Don't use sources like Joyce Meyer or Kenneth Copeland or the Christian Post, sources that are basically lacking in scholarly expertise and are aimed at what you might call ordinary people, which is fine on that level, but not on the level of an academic source that's on par with McGrath or on Armstrong. You must look for appropriate sources in respect to that. It would be like me doing a course on nursing, if I can pick that out. And when I come to a source to look for on nursing, I go to something like WebMD, and then I quote from WebMD. And the lecturer would say, what? I can't use that. I've got to use an appropriate source, because WebMD is a generic notion to help people who are just looking up something in terms of a therapeutic method endeavour in terms of how they are to approach an injury or whatever they've got, but it doesn't count when it comes to studying methodologically, professionally, and what nursing is all about. I'm going to send you an article that was written in 1948 by George Orwell. It's called The Politics of English, and it's a brilliant paper that he wrote that is still relevant today. It talks about cliches. Many of you still operate on the basis of cliches and slang within your paper. This goes back to writing informal material. When you're putting forth an argument, you don't use slang, colloquialisms, cliches. For example, what Isaac Newton said was crazy. Crazy? You can't use language like that. Can you imagine making an argument in nursing in terms of this therapeutic endeavour is crazy? You can't get away with that. And you can't get away with that theologically. In other words, then, you've got to be sophisticated enough to write down what you're saying. And this comes back to fluff. I've said this before. When you write stuff on a monitor, what you have to do by a monitor in a computer, and you look at it, then you've got to cull what you do, what you say. I know I've done this. I did this many, many years ago when I was doing undergraduate work, is that you look and you say, oh, I've got 750 words to write. Therefore, what do? Well, you write, and you think, oh, I've done 750, 800, that's it. Be proud of what you write. Look at it. Print it from the monitor, and I suggest you read it out loud, because then you can pick up the grammatical mistakes. Because even if you don't know a lot about the theory of grammar, which I hope that you do, but if you don't, you have an internal sense of grammar. I sometimes teach this. I used to do it when I was teaching grammar of English language, is that I can make up a sentence like queaky burbs, gollop, squibbly olbles, surreptitious. Now that doesn't make any sense in terms of content, but I would write that on the board and I would say to students, which is the verb? And they'd say, what? And then they would look at it and they couldn't understand what was said because it's sort of gobbledygook, but they could pick out the verb. And then I would say, tell me a noun. And then they would pick out a word, a noun. And then I would say, what is the adjective that goes with the noun? Well, the noun is squirble. What's the adjective? Oh, it's squicky. Oh, squicky squirbles, you see. In other words, everybody has a basic internal sense of grammar. And frequently, you can work it out by speaking out loud what you've written. He saw that the principles of this was undue elements of the physics of the, you read that out loud, and what the internal grammar says is this is a split sentence. It's two sentences really, and you try to put it together in one. Your own internal logic will tell you that as you read it out loud. I suggest you do that. Print it from the computer, from the monitor, and read it out loud. And then you can spot mistakes. And then you won't have me correcting you if I do in terms of grammar and so forth. And then the other element of it is get rid of the fluff. Here's the fluff. I write fluff too. The fluff is this material on Amanda Berry Smith is much better than the material that I read on Isaac Newton. It appeals to me much more than the other saints that I've read. Well, you've only got 750 words and you've probably just used about 80 of them, and you've not said anything. If you want to say why this appeals to you, what Amanda Berry Smith wrote rather than Isaac Newton, the chapter on Amanda Berry Smith as opposed to Isaac Newton. When I write stuff like that, I read it and I say, this is fluff. What is it that appeals to me about Smith over Newton? And then I write the reason of why this appeals to me, and I start from there. So get rid of the fluff. Look at it through. I know it's a lot. It admits it's a lot harder because you're getting rid of 80 words that fill up your 750. But I want you to be proud of what you write. I want it to be the word I learned. Okay, I'm an old guy. A generation ago, this is what I learned. A word saved is a kingdom gained. In other words, as you cull it, squeeze it together, it becomes better and better. 25 years ago, the supervisor of my PhD in Scotland said this to me once: a paper can always suffer another edit. You get that? It can always suffer another edit. Now, at some point, you've got to give the thing in. I know that. So at least let it suffer one edit, print it from the monitor, read it through, maybe out loud, and then make corrections and submit it. Enough said. Now, thinking. A number of you are really latched on to some good ideas in terms of Amanda Berry Smith and Isaac Newton in particular. Why? Because their lifestyle, the way they lived, resonates with the culture of what's going on now. The whole Black Lives Matter movement, the notion of slavery with Newton, the way that Amanda Berry Smith acted as a revolutionary and didn't live according to the norms of her particular culture. You weave that in respect to the ideas of what was going on now and what you think of what's going on now in respect to what was going on then. And I gave you credit for it because I liked it, because you were thinking through this material. That's what I want from you. I want you to dig deep in respect to what you think about these things. It's so easy to just dig in a sort of peripheral way. The easiest way is to look at this material and then sort of make a corresponding Bible quote from it. Charles Sheldon used his wealth to bless others, and Jesus said in Matthew 6, and then you quote Matthew 6, lay up not treasures for yourself but treasure in heaven, and you quote all that. Well, you've only got, as I say, whatever it is, 750 words. You don't need to quote the scripture. With due respect, I know the New Testament. I know the scripture. All you need to do is to actually put the scripture in there, Matthew 6:24, and I will know that what is. I'm a bit more rusty when it comes to the Old Testament because I'm a New Testament scholar, but I can look that up, I can see it, and so forth. You don't have to fill it out like that. And if you do quote the scripture, then take it further than that. Don't just quote it and say, oh, this goes back to what I think in terms of the way that wealth is used. You need to explore it deeper and not just in a peripheral way. Then you move on to the next point. So you just sort of, in a very surface way, just making points. Go deep, as some of you have done with Amanda Berry Smith, as I said, or Newton. But some of you have missed some big things along the way. For example, I don't know what your religious proclivity is, but if a number of you are Protestants, nobody really wanted to deal with Anthony of Egypt in respect to him being the father of monasticism, which was completely rejected by Protestants in the 16th century, which Armstrong didn't bring out. Monasticism was a total break in terms of a rejection by Luther and Calvin and the whole Protestant Reformation, which it still is. In a sense, monks are anathema, but the monastic life has been brought into Protestantism with people like Richard Foster and so on. But nobody picked that up and actually tried to go against it. You can go against it with me. In other words, what I'm looking for. You don't have to agree with me or Armstrong. In fact, looking at sharp disagreements and giving reasons for it leads me to wake up, so to speak, and give you a good mark. I'm not looking for you to be a sycophant of me or of Armstrong. I'm looking for you to think for yourself, like you did with Amanda Berry Smith or with Newton and so forth. Same thing with what we've just done with Sheldon. Obviously, one of the points that Armstrong brings out, one of the key points that's going on today with people in the Calvinistic tradition, and you know all about this now from what you've studied, the Arminians, the Calvinists and so forth, that's concurrent today with people like Timothy Keller and John MacArthur and John Piper and so on in that Calvinistic tradition, those who are against the social gospel movement, or what's called the social gospel warriors, the whole idea that was initiated by people like Charles Sheldon, which is the anomaly of do you simply go along with the element of the way to get and change society is through the conversion of individuals, which is based upon a theology of atonement, which comes back to all the stuff that you've read in terms of theories of the atonement in McGrath? Or is it that you should, in a sense, subsume that, or perhaps even abandon it, to the degree in which you aim at society as a whole to change it, as people like Rauschenbach and Sheldon perhaps did? You could dig that a little bit deeper. One of the things I would do when I'm studying this, I know you've got limited time, but at least what you can do is you can look at Armstrong's chapter and then go to Wikipedia and just read Wikipedia on these particular devotional scholars or church people. And that will give you a balanced perspective. And then you could look and then look at them from... nobody did this with Sheldon in respect to what's going on with the social gospel movement as it relates to, for example, of today, because it's a very important movement. For example, Sojourners with what's his name, Jim Wallis, is very big on this, and one of the criticisms that's coming out of the Southern Baptist movement with Al Mohler is the discrepancy between the focus upon changing society as opposed to changing the individual. And actually the Southern Baptist movement at the moment is actually going in a way of trying to deal with critical race theory, intersectionality, and identity politics, and how to deal with that with their lineage. Because in the 19th century, the Southern Baptists, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, was founded by individuals who owned slaves. And that feeds right into the Black Lives Matter movement with what's going on today with the eradication of statues and so forth. So I've gone on perhaps too much in terms of what I wanted to initially say. But I hope you've taken to heart what I've said in terms of writing the last few papers in this course and writing papers in other courses. Thank you.